Greetings, everybody. My name is David Sandalow. I'm the Inaugural Fellow here at the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy, and I am thrilled to be welcoming today Jim Rogers, who is, by any measure, one of the top leaders in the U.S. energy industry in this century. Jim has served for almost 25 years as the CEO of utilities, before resigning about 2 years ago now as the CEO of Duke Energy. But I can testify from personal experience that Jim's influence extends beyond simply running large utilities, which is pretty influential on its own. But he's also one of the most respected voices on energy issues in this country, on a wide range of issues. So we're really thrilled to have him here today. And I want to get the wording of this right, because just to reflect that, Newsweek magazine in 2009 called Jim one of the 50 most powerful people in the world. So we're delighted you're here for this. Jim has served as a director on the boards of 8 Fortune 500 companies. He's the winner of countless awards and honorary degrees. But most important, and the reason he's here today, is he has written a new book. And this new book, it is both excellent and important. The book is out about 2 months ago, I think. And I highly commend it. It's lighting the world. And it is a great read. It's superb. It's extremely engaging. And it addresses an extremely vital topic, which we're going to hear from Jim about. And I'm also delighted to announce that Jim is our newest non-resident fellow at the Columbia Center for Global Energy Policy. So we're delighted to welcome Jim to the Columbia community as part of this. On that note, some program notes. We have a steady series of events here at the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy. Actually, next Thursday and Friday, the Columbia Student Energy Association is hosting their annual energy symposium, and I hope all of you have seen the posters around. Please go next Thursday and Friday. And then on Thursday, November 12th, we are hosting NRG CEO David Crane, friend of Jim's, who will be here to talk about what he's doing. Please follow us on Twitter at Columbia U Energy. And for those of you who are watching on the web, you can ask questions of Jim at CGEP events. After Jim talks, I'm going to have a conversation with him on stage, and then we're going to have an open microphone for questions. Please join me in welcoming Jim Rogers.
Thank you. David, thank you. David, thank you very much. I am delighted to be here, and thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon. What I'm going to try to do, and what David and I are doing, is David really gave me the mission of being provocative, to really stimulate questions. I don't really think you have to stimulate many questions in this area, but I'm going to do that. But I'm going to start first by simply sharing with you why I made the decision to write this book. It's not something that you would think automatically that a CEO in the power sector would do, particularly spending much of his career in the U.S., even though I did business in 17 different countries, but primarily they were power plants, distribution operations, more of what a lot of people in the low-income countries call first world power. But when I made the decision to write this book, I had 2 missions. One was to put a spotlight on the issue. Think about it. 1.2 billion people have no access to electricity. Almost hard to imagine. I would dare say no one in this room grew up without electricity. But the 1.2 billion are spread out around the world. 600 million in Africa, 300 million in India, about 100 million in Indonesia, 35 million in the Amazon area in Latin America, and others spread out across the world. So the numbers are daunting. 1 in 7 people on the planet with no access to electricity. Actually, when Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, the 1.2 billion is pretty close to the number of people that were on the planet at that time. So this is a situation that's remarkable and hard to even imagine. The second reason that I wrote the book was really to try to inspire young leaders, old leaders, all leaders in NGOs, in government, in corporations, to take their talent, take their resources, and invest in trying to solve this problem. In a sense of the word, access to electricity is foundational. Foundational in the sense of what it enables. It enables medical care, education, economic development, safety, a long list. It also enables access to the internet. And I actually believe by the end of this century that access to the internet will become a basic human right. And not even today is access to electricity considered a basic human right. Clean water, sanitation by the UN is considered a basic human right, but not access to electricity. I'll come back about why that's the case. I call it the blind spot. The blind spot that so many of us have in high-income countries with respect to this issue. And maybe the way to talk about the blind spot is to say that, think about the UN. In 2000, they put together the Millennium Development Goals. When they put that list together, access to electricity was not on the list, surprisingly. Now, they have kind of come around in their thinking, and when they announced at the end of September the Sustainable Development Goals, access to electricity was number 7. So there's growing recognition, at least at the UN, with respect to this. For me, I grew up in a small town in the South. I lived in a house that, when it was first built, had no access to electricity. Fireplaces in every room, high ceilings. In the early days, we burned coal to keep the house warm. And the bottom line is we'd had no access. So I never experienced it. But something happened to me when I was young. I read this great book by Robert K. Rowe about Lyndon Johnson, Path to Power. And the most moving chapter in the book was a chapter that focused on how the lives of women were changed when they brought electricity to the rural areas of Texas. 1 out of 10 ranches / farms in my part of the country had no access to electricity. And when you look at the life of women in that time, if you were 25 years old, the work that you had to do on the farm, whether it was gathering water, go through the list of things that they had to do every day, but at 25, they looked like 55. It was a hard life. And how it changed their lives is dramatic. And actually, around the world in these low-income countries, you see how the lives of women could change and could transform the communities in which they live in. So access to electricity is really, I think, key, something that has not been seen. And I will tell you, in researching this, I looked at books on poverty. Nobody really talked about access to electricity. I read books on health care. Nobody talks about refrigeration and what it takes for refrigeration or education. Nobody really understood that access. I did a small project in Argentina, in Patagonia, small town called Cochico. It was a regional school where kids came and spent 3 weeks. They went home for a week. But the school and the small village only had access from a generator 4 hours a day. And one of the projects that I worked on is that we attracted the money. We brought companies together from around the country. I was then chairing a group called Global Sustainable Electricity Partners, 11 of the largest utilities around the world. We funded the building of a micro-hydro project in that area. And by blending the micro-hydro with the generator, they could get 24/7 power It was transformative to the village, but transformative to the school, and I believe will be transformative to the future of the children that go there. So the challenge that we have is we have this major problem. We have a blind spot in terms of how we think about it. Let me take a few moments before David and I sit down and talk about this, to talk about some of the impediments. I'm just going to touch on them, but I want you to kind of start to think about them as we talk about this going forward. The number one impediment, surprisingly, the number one impediment is the government in low-income countries. In most of these countries, the utility is state-owned. And in these countries, they don't have the capital to build out the grid the way we build out the grid in the United States, or the way we did it in Europe. Yet, they haven't really developed a model or put the capital in to bring electricity to the rural areas of their country. Maybe their focus is all on those who are connected to the grid, but only have intermittent, interruptible, 6 hours, maybe 12 hours, unpredictable access. Actually, there are 1 billion people in the world that have intermittent access to electricity, even though they might be connected to the grid. That's a whole separate problem to deal with. But the governments are impediments, and they're co-conspirators of the World Bank, OPEC, because they believe in the story of first world power. They believe that if you build a big central station plant like we did here, if you build transmission and distribution, that's the way forward. The World Bank actually last year, only 1.5% of their funding went to rural electrification. And if you look at these other development banks, the story's the same. USAID, it's the same. Even Power Africa has a de minimis amount going to rural electrification. Now, we're blessed in the United States because in that period, when I talked about Lyndon Johnson, Cairo did, when 1 in 10 farms had no access, this was in the early 30s. We were able to pass the Rural Electrification Act and bring the capital in to solve it. But in these countries, there's been a reluctance. There's a reluctance, but the world has changed over the last 5 or 10 years. And let me quickly say, if I'd have written this book 5 years ago, it'd have been a different book. One, solar, the cost and the affordability of it's fallen dramatically. Go back to 2008. You could get a solar panel where you paid about $4 a watt. Today, you can buy solar at 65 cents a watt. So the price has come down dramatically. It's continuing to fall. New storage technologies are coming that's going to allow you to store the electricity. Story in the New York Times this morning about a storage company. There's stories everywhere. This technology's coming. But those who are bullish on storage, I remind them about what Thomas Edison said in 1895. He said the development of storage will transform the power sector, and its development is just around the corner. It's been a very long corner. I see it in sight, but I do think it will not only transform what goes on in the third world, but it will fundamentally transform what we do in the United States. The other technological development that's really making this possible is now people have gone to work to build the most energy efficient refrigeration, fans, TVs. They're smaller in size. They use less energy. And at the end of the day, this development for the developing world could transform the appliances that we have in this country. And you'll see reading the book, actually, that there's this idea that kind of runs through it. The idea that if we do a good job of solving rural electrification, at the end of the day, we're going to have the capability to transform our grid, transform how we produce electricity, and maybe transform and lead to productivity gains in how we use electricity in the United States. And I was talking before I digressed about why governments in these low-income countries block. One of the reasons is kind of old-fashioned and having done business around the world. It's really about the money, this money, corruption. If you have a $1 billion plant that you're building, it's pretty, taking 5% off of it, 10% off it's pretty easy to do. If you're putting solar panels in remote areas, very difficult to do. So you have the co-conspiracy thing going as people become more and more aware of the new technologies. You have the corruption aspect of it. Then you have another sort of insidious set of problems. One is they subsidize the use of kerosene. In India, they subsidize the cost of electricity. And so these subsidies make it very difficult to deploy renewables, whether at utility scale or in these remote rural areas. So the government is one area, raising capital is another. It's hard to form capital. I've tried to highlight in the book a lot of the leading companies, but here's the reality, they're small. I mean, at Duke, we were spending $6 to $7 billion a year to reinvest in our infrastructure. These companies are talking about every couple of years raising $20 to $30 to $40 million. So the size of the capital needed is great. The capability to raise it, not so much. So there's a lot of small companies doing good work, very driven, but the truth of the matter is there's social entrepreneurs who do not have the bankroll to make it happen. So you have the financial limitations. The other thing that I thought was so important, whether you're in Kenya or Tanzania or Uganda, name an sub-Saharan African country, whether you're in India, whether you're in Central or South America, the reality is in this kind of business of providing electricity in these remote areas, the cultural differences are great. And what I've identified as a winning formula is people that go and listen to people in the villages. And that when they listen, the ideas about how to proceed become increasingly obvious if they ask the right questions. But probably importantly, it's important to select people within the villages. The most successful ones that pick the leaders in the village to endorse what they're doing. All of us in this room would say it's a no-brainer. Everybody should want electricity, but not everybody does right away. So there's an important educational process. There's an important process of listening and kind of getting that information back. It's an important process in trying to make sure that you are being thoughtful and recognizing it's a long lead time. I think there's a ladder of technologies that will be deployed over time. I also believe, and this is a conversation we could have, I believe people should pay for it. I don't think charity works. Africa's littered with examples of technologies thrown aside. It's littered with examples of people that gave stuff away and people didn't embrace. You want people to embrace. You want people to use it. You want people to have the capability to fix it when it's broken. And that's an important part of all these entrepreneurs is bringing people and educating people to do that. The other thing that makes solar unique in these remote areas is the capability to pay. I mean, we all know 1 billion people live on less than $2 a day. Great article in The Economist that talks about 6% of the people in Africa are in the middle class. The middle class is like somewhere between $10 and $30 a day. But these that make less than $2 a day, the capability to pay is really critical. So when you look at this ladder of technology, what you're really looking at is solar lanterns on the first rung, solar lanterns that charge cell phones. The next rung is small home solar systems, go up to a larger home solar, and then ultimately microgrids. And I actually think microgrids hold great promise, and the capability to pay rises as the economic development in the community grows. So as you look at the impediments, you look at how people are approaching it, I think we're fast on the way, more to do. But we could be fast on the way to solving the problem as the cost of solar goes down and the efficiency of appliances really improve. I will end by simply saying, you're probably sitting there saying, how can a CEO, 25 years in the power sector, how would a guy go off in this first book? I mean, this isn't a book about what a great job I did as a CEO. This is not even about climate change. I tried not to make it a climate book, although it really is a climate book, because if you look at these countries, when you bring electricity to those remote areas, that increases the probability that they will be able to step up and make commitments with respect to climate going forward. The ability to leapfrog. I mean, look at the leapfrogging that occurred with cell phones in Africa. 90% of the people in Africa have cell phones. They didn't need long lines to get to cell phones. In the same sense, I think solar, when deployed along the lines I was saying, do it. Now, the two things, and David, we can jump into this, but let me just quickly say, the idea that I had is, I kind of took a couple of ideas. Took the idea of rural electrification in America. I said, let's go to these countries. Let's get the governments to buy in. Let's get the governments to create franchises. Carve out a piece of land. And then basically auction them off. Let people come and pay money to provide electricity. And the good news is people that win, they have a franchise area, which is very similar to the way we did electrification in America. I ran an investor-owned utility, and we were in 6 states, but every state we had franchises. Your ability to borrow money at lower cost is so much better in that context. So the opportunity is great with franchises. It's great when you're using renewables. And at the end of the day, it translates in making progress. And that's really what it's all about. So let me stop with that. That's kind of a Pony Express kind of view of how I'm thinking. But I hope it engendered some questions for y'all, but I know it probably did with David.
That's great.
Thank you.
That's great, Jim. I'm going to put the book right here. I highly recommend it. It's filled with good stories and clear explanations. Jim, let's just start kind of with the basics. How did you get focused on this? Was there any one trip or any series of trips that opened your eyes to the importance of this issue?
You know, life is about a series of kind of serendipitous things happening to you. I had mentioned to y'all about the Robert Caro book. That was my first indication of what that was all about. And as I said, it gave me a great sense of what I was doing as a CEO in the power sector. You know, I woke up every morning knowing I was transforming millions of people's lives when they have the ability to turn the electricity on. But what really happened is I was in Africa, in Kenya actually, when I was in this village. I was with a couple of my grandchildren. And I went there for 2 purposes. I went there for why everybody goes on safari, but I went there not just for safari. I wanted my grandchildren to really have a more profound understanding of the culture. So we had the opportunity to travel to many villages across the country. And in this one village, a young man was wearing an Obama t-shirt, appropriate for Kenya, and he had a cell phone. I didn't speak Swahili. My guide did, and basically I asked the question, well, how do you charge it? There's no electricity in your village. And his response was, well, I walk 3 hours, I pay somebody to charge it, and then I walk back. Now, I know y'all don't do that. I hope you don't do it. But I actually feel a little put out when I check into a hotel and I can't plug in my phone next to the bed. So walking 3 hours sounds pretty remarkable, but it's pretty routine. So that was one example. The work I did in Central America and Cochico is another. So there's a series of things.
What did you do there?
That's the story about bringing 24/7 electricity to this rural village school where people came from all over the country to visit.
You made an interesting and potentially controversial statement in your remarks about it's important to pay for it, and this isn't all about charity. Could you just elaborate on that? Why is that the case?
I think every entrepreneur that I talk to that's in this area kind of understood that there needs to be a value proposition. It needs to be priced so people can afford it. And actually, Off-Grid Electric in Tanzania, the leader of that company, Xavier Helgeson, he basically, because they wanted people to be able to pay for it, they designed the payment to be at a prepayment for electricity at the same level people pay for a subsidized liter of kerosene. And because he was using, and by the way, when you look at his device, it looks like Apple made the device that's in the village. And he can control it, turn it on and off from San Francisco. And the bottom line is he's using technologies today. I mean, the convergence of solar, battery, the internet, cell phone, that convergence of technologies has made his business model viable today. So the pricing is to get it right. And you know, and maybe it's old-fashioned for me to say this, but I truly believe that when people pay, when they invest, they treat it differently. I said this a little earlier. And you know that the contrast between India and Africa in these small villages is interesting, in the sense that Africa has been filled with more things given away. You know, all you have to see is all the junk that's there, or leftover this or that or the other, that people with good intentions and goodwill brought to these different villages. But at the end of the day, they weren't there to fix them. They weren't there to help. They were there to feel good about delivery. I'm saying engage people, educate people, help them own it, because the ownership of it, to me, is really a step in the right direction.
Do you need training programs for engineers and other types of repair? How's that going to work?
Right. I mean, there's a guy in India called Bunker Roy. I love this example. He basically has this thing called Barefoot College. And he recruits grandmothers, you know, people my age. He recruits grandmothers to teach them how to build an inverter and attach it to a solar panel. He claims that his grandmother's a hell of a lot faster and more and better able to do this than the best engineers from colleges across America. That's an example. Another great example is Practical Action, which is a group in the UK. And what they've done so well, especially in Peru, they were building out micro hydro there. What they did there is that they developed training programs. So I think an important part of all these governments, all these organizations, is for people to basically develop training capability. And so I just think that that's so doable.
You mentioned in your talk the idea of franchising, and it's a very interesting chapter of your book. Could you just elaborate on that and what you mean and how that would work?
You know, a way to think about it is you just have to take a map, you have to understand where people live, and then you have to think of, you know, your first thought is gerrymandering. I mean, my God, look at what we do with our congressional districts. I'm not envisioning anything quite that illogical. I'm really envisioning something where you look at where people live, and then you sort of design it, and you think in terms of what is the right size, so that if somebody wins the franchise, they're able to borrow the money at a lower cost. They're able to work in that area with their sole mission. Now, the franchise area isn't to bring anything to these franchises. You have requirements, quality requirements in terms of the solar. You can have price caps in terms of the deployment in the area. You can have requirements in terms of scaling, whether it's from solar lanterns up to microgrids, so you have the capability to do that over time. The government, it's totally in their control to design what the requirements, what the responsibilities are of those who win the auction. So I think that idea, and as I said earlier, it is identical to what we did in this country. 80% of electricity in this country comes from investor-owned utilities. The rest comes from municipals and co-ops. And even the municipals and co-ops created maps. So if you look at a map of the United States, you got 2,000 plus suppliers of electricity, but with each is a little map of the area that they serve. So we were really able to do that in the early part of the 20th century. I think we can draw maps and make that happen. I mean, now we have GPS. I mean, our capability to do it now is better than ever.
So would these be monopoly suppliers in the franchise area?
Yes. And you go, well, no, competition's a good thing. Absolutely, it's a good thing, but the competition comes on bidding on the franchise areas. It gives people an opportunity to deliver in those areas. And I think the benefit of bringing the capital, getting commitments from private companies, trumps the advantage that would come with having competition within these areas.
Very interesting. So I want to come back to this, particularly we're going to have questions from the floor if anybody wants to talk about the issues in your book. And maybe just to go beyond the areas in your book to kind of U.S. utilities and U.S. utility policy. I heard a U.S. utility CEO a couple of years ago say, everybody likes our product, but nobody likes how we make our product or how we get it to them. And I wonder, just kind of reflecting on your experience as a utility CEO, does that ring true? And with a couple of years distance, any thoughts about the U.S. utility industry today? It's obviously an industry in turmoil.
All our customers in the South love us. No, I'm just... Well, actually, it's a function of what the price is in a lot of areas. But I would make an important observation. And a lot of us have forgotten this history. When you look at the 20th century, actually the National Academy of Engineers looked at the 20th century and they asked the question, what is the single greatest engineering achievement? Now, the guy that chaired that was on my board for about 10 years. His name is Neil Armstrong. And so he led the effort to identify. And you say to yourself, was it cars? Was it radio? Was it TV? Was it the internet? Was it computers? Was it even putting a man on the moon? It was none of those things. The single greatest engineering achievement was the electrification of America, providing universal access to every home and business. Because think of what life was like in 1900. Just like in the low-income countries today, 50% of our people in this country worked in farms or worked in agriculture-related businesses. Life expectancy was very low. I mean, 50-ish in the early 1900s. And when we brought electricity, we couldn't envision what it enabled. We couldn't envision refrigeration. We couldn't envision air conditioning, how it transformed the South and the Southwest, and really has facilitated living in major cities like New York because of the ability, the air conditioning is transformative. Couldn't envision radio or TV, couldn't envision any of that when we started, and yet it transformed our lives. We don't remember life before that, and we don't remember the quality of life. We don't remember the life expectancy. So electricity has been transformative. The other thing that it did, and I'll quickly say this, I've been to Beijing a lot. There are good days and bad days in Beijing, more bad than good. You could hardly see your hand in front of you. Guess what? Go to Chicago, go to Cleveland, go to Detroit, go to Youngstown, go to Pittsburgh. Before there was electricity in those cities, you couldn't see your hand in front of yourself. So the actual provision of electricity in this country led to the cleaning up of all the major cities as we moved the production of electricity into the rural area. Then along came the Environmental Protection Act in 1970, and we started on the road of cleaning up all our all our generation plants. This is a long answer, David, but here's the important point. When we were providing universal access, the whole focus was on affordability and reliability, and cleaning up the cities was just a byproduct of providing this advanced technology. And actually, I would say we were the high-tech companies of that area. We were the Googles, the Microsoft. I know you don't look at me and think that now, but we were back in that period. And the reality is we've transformed this economy, and now we're starting to think in terms of affordability, reliability, and clean. And since EPA in 1970, Clean Air Act amendments, you get it confused with all the new rules, but that allowed us to reduce SOx, then we reduced NOx. So there's been a continuous cleaning of the air from the power plants. So people say, well, not clean enough. Well, we will be, more to come, but let's kind of understand where we've been. And I think the most important thing here is we have yet to find the perfect way to generate electricity. No perfect way. If it's affordable, it might not be reliable. It might be affordable and reliable like coal, but it's dirty, it's not clean. It might be clean like wind and solar, but not reliable, when the wind blows, sun shines, but it's not affordable, yet the price is coming down. My only point in saying all this, people don't understand where we've been, and they don't have a clear view of where technology is taking us tomorrow. And the other thing I would say is, in our industry, there's a lot of, and in the environmental community, there's a lot of theology. And that's all good, but the important thing is we need to move beyond the theology to what is doable and accelerating these new trends.
A lot of people are talking about a utility death spiral as customers leave because of distributed solar. What are your thoughts on that?
I think distributed solar is more expensive than utility scale solar. Yet, in February of next year, we'll have over 1 million homes with solar on the rooftop. So it's a trend that's accelerating. Will it translate into lower sales by utilities? Probably. But at the end of the day, companies have got to make decisions. When I was CEO, I invested $4 billion in wind and solar projects, selling the output to utilities around the country. After I left, we bought a company in California that puts solar on the rooftop of commercial businesses. So this is just business. You can sit there and do nothing, and yes, there'll be a death spiral. Or you can say, I'm going to take what we have, I'm going to take our low cost of capital, I'm going to take our balance sheet, and I'm going to play in this era. And the issue is will the competitors, Solar City, to name one, or others, will they block utility companies participating in this market? Time will tell on that.
And do you think the regulatory models are sufficient, or around the United States in particular, for this type of evolution?
Well, remember the regulatory model we have today was built on kilowatt-hour sales. The more I sell, the more I make. And it also rewarded me for providing universal access to every home and business. Now everybody's got it. Now I should be incented to have productivity gains in generation, transmission, distribution, and help my customers have productivity gains in the use of electricity. At the same time, the model's got to change where I'm rewarded, and the I'm in this is the royal me, as in we, at Duke, where we are rewarded for optimizing the system, facilitating solar on the rooftop, facilitating investments on the other side of the meter, facilitating moving the grid from analog to digital with two-way communication, facilitating the indispensable grid for the new world. So we're at a kind of a point where we need to start turning and focusing and investing, and we need public policy which is trailing technology. That's a long conversation in itself. public policy just needs to get on the same page as technology. And forget public policy that facilitates technology. We do a little bit of that today on solar and wind, and not as much on battery, but we need to facilitate it. We need to get the public policy in step or ahead of the technology that's today incoming.
Let me ask about one specific public policy, and then just about ready to turn to the crowd. The Clean Power Plan, the Obama administration's climate change rule, which will limit, for those who aren't familiar with this, will limit carbon emissions from existing power plants. Big impact on utilities around the country. What's your thought on it?
In this country, we need a price on carbon. We need a cap on emissions, period. We tried hard with Waxman and Markey. We passed the House, couldn't pass the Senate. There were 17 Democrats from coal-producing states, and another sort of factoid that drives the politics. 25% or 25 states in this country have more than 50% of the electricity come from coal. So they were concerned about the impact on the people of their state in making this transition. Let's not forget the late 70s when we made it against the law to burn natural gas, which we're burning today, with lower emissions of carbon, almost 50% of the emissions of carbon. And we had 3 Mile Island. So the only thing we could build as the country grew was to build coal. So getting this transition right is important. The good news is the Waxman-Markey bill was on the way. And the only I say this in a soft way, but our president was MIA. He didn't push those 17 Democrats to pass it, even though it passed the House. So here we are. The bill didn't pass. Congress, actually the Democrats, with no help from Republicans, didn't finish the job. This is back in 2009. And now we have the Clean Power Plan. And the Clean Power Plan puts a price on carbon, puts a cap on. There's some parts of it that I think are going to be challenged. I'd bet that. And it has some unintended or maybe intended consequences. You don't think the EPA is an organization to pick technologies. But they basically have put a cap in some regions of the country on gas. They have basically passed what some people are going to characterize, and I can understand why, as a national renewable portfolio standard around 28%. They basically have structured a bill that puts another nail in the coffin of coal, and guess what? Gas had already put coal in the coffin. I mean, all they're doing is just tacking on a few nails. And interestingly, and kind of counterintuitive, there appears to be a bias against nuclear, and more than 64% of the carbon-free electricity in this country comes from nuclear. I mean, think about what's happening in Germany today as they shut down their nuclear plants. They're building lignite coal plants. After tripling the price of electricity for residential, now you're seeing the price of electricity up, but you're seeing the emissions of CO2 rise. So the Clean Power Plan is imperfect, but it's an important step in the right direction, and that what needs to get fixed will get fixed. But it gets our country on the road, and it actually helps our president go to Paris at the end of this year and say, we're on the way to solving the problem. And absent that, we weren't solving the problem. However, I'll say, and I know there's strong points of view about fracking, strong points of view about shale gas, but guess what? Shale gas, our company, we built $7 billion worth of plants, gas plants, and from 2005 to today, Duke has reduced its carbon footprint 25%. That's before there was any regulations. That's in anticipation that there'll be a price on carbon. So that's why I think the price on carbon is so critical and so important. But just the shutdown of old plants and the burning of gas is translated into lower carbon. The only other thing I'd say about clean power, then I'll stop. Weirdly, it actually puts a cap on natural gas. So when I say the EPA was picking technologies, they bias against nuclear, cap on gas in some regions of the country, no to coal, unless you have what today is too costly carbon capture and sequestration. So the only thing you have left to build is renewables. So I think the challenge for our country and for the utility segment is to maintain affordable, reliable, and clean, with a greater emphasis on clean. But we're going to be challenged if the only thing we can build, because the federal government said only renewables, and by the way, no country in the world is all renewables, although Denmark is getting close. But they sit in the middle of the Nordic grid, and that's not a huge risk for them in that context. So let me stop with that. And
okay, one more question. Returning to your book, I was thinking about the students in the audience and wondered if you have any career advice or thoughts for anybody who is interested in engaging on the issues that you write about. What should they do? What type of training should they get? What type of opportunity should they pursue?
You know, life is about purpose. Purpose. And this challenge is so great. There is a huge set of opportunities here for people that see this as their mission. Yes, you can make money doing it, but more importantly, you can solve a really important problem that faces the 1.2 billion people on this planet. And I believe that I see it in terms of my own career. I mean, my goodness, I felt like I had great purpose. You know, you go, well, not so much purpose if you're a lawyer. But in my early days, I was a consumer advocate in my home state, fighting rate increases of utilities. I mean, hell, I've come a long way. but I felt like I had purpose then. I had purpose when I worked in the government at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I had purpose as a CEO for 25 years because I'm transforming millions of people's lives. But maybe more important, my purpose was to shape energy and environmental policy, and that's one of the things I really focused on. Find purpose. And this area, the purpose couldn't be clearer, the opportunity couldn't be greater, and I'd urge y'all to consider this. Even if you don't consider this, find something to do. You can make money doing a lot of things. Making money's good. My kids are excited about how I've done. But the important thing is your life has to have meaning. And I think that with a purposeful life, you will find the meaning that will give you a deeper sense of the possibilities and maybe a deeper sense of who you are.
If you have a question for Jim Rogers, please raise your hand. We've got microphones that will come around. For those listening on podcast, I'm David Sandalow from the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy. I'm here with Jim Rogers, the former CEO of Duke Energy and the author of Lighting the World. Sir, please identify yourself.
Hi, my name's Fred Sherman. I'm a retired physician. I'm refired and have purpose like you do. My wife and I run a not-for-profit in Jamaica, and so we're coming along, and it deals with literacy. And without light, there can be no literacy. And so the issue of solar and biodiesel and other forms of energy in a country like Jamaica is an issue in rural Jamaica, because I think without that, the literacy issue is tightly linked to that. And your opening comments about, and your comments as well, is about the government impeding the development of these cheaper sources of energy is a real issue. Could you elaborate on that? Because it affects so many aspects of literacy and education. And you comment on education in schools in Africa. I've been to schools and education in rural Jamaica, and it's just as terrible. And, you know.
No, and thank you very much for your mission. I think that's a really important mission. And you know, solar lights now, I mean, with LED lights, they have more lumens than obviously candles or reading by kerosene. And they're going to advance further. But I want to go beyond lights to having access to the internet. I think that is a really important thing. I mean, the internet will deliver education, it will deliver job opportunities, it will be your community, it will provide so much of the future world. I think that governments are tough. That's why I put them number one on the list of impediments. You know, your question you have to ask, I mean, you think that Jamaica, I mean, solar, how hard is that there, right? Wind, I mean, should be automatic. The math should work with that. But the people that supply kerosene to the power plants on the island are diesel. They have interest. And actually one way to do it, and I thought about this in the context of what's going on in Africa and India, where the kerosene market is so large, is to try to get the suppliers of kerosene to invest and be a supplier of solar lanterns, to be a supplier of home solar systems, to be a supplier of capital for microgrids. You have to kind of help them find a way so that they're not an impediment going forward. And you're sitting there going, well, that's above kind of my pay grade and mission. But I do think, certainly true in the US, but certainly true in every one of these countries, the government policy, the government, and the production and delivery of power are inextricably linked. So you have to work at that interface between the government and the provision in order to develop an opportunity to achieve your mission in terms of giving people the capability to read, to be literate, to basically help develop their future and lead to the economic development of the island beyond tourism.
Other questions? Got one right here.
Daniel Goldman, an alum of the college. Thank you very much for a terrific talk. So you alluded to how governments, despite the successes of high-tech distributed systems in areas such as banking and telecom and mobile, still are refusing to finance these sorts of engagements. And so I'm wondering what you think can be done on the development finance end with respect to development banks and governments, as well as persuading people who are familiar with high-risk, high-tech finance, venture capitalists and angel investors to back projects like this rather than focus on applications which may have a marginal benefit to the lives of the wealthy.
I think the first thing I'd say, go to India, go to Africa, look at the local banks. First, they're thinly capitalized on a relative basis. The second thing is they have no experience in lending to companies that are doing rural electrification. And having been on the board of a bank for a long time, I learned that you have to have a credit history. And actually, when I first moved our company into the wind business, most banks in the United States weren't as open. We were building wind in Spain and looking at building wind in the U.S. The banks in the Netherlands were really understood the financing of wind farms. So my solution really is for World Bank, USAID, name the development bank, that they create a facility for 10 to 15 local banks where they basically backstop the loan, or they take out 90% of the loan, but kind of get some participation from the local bank. Because again, it's just like ownership versus charitable. You want people to start to, on a risk-adjusted basis, start to invest. And so that idea of strengthening local banks is a way forward. And I believe that that is a better way forward and a better use, actually, much better use of the money at the World Bank or the money at USAID, because it leverages their money, some, not a lot, but what it does is it educates local bankers to understand the industry, understand the risk, and make bets in the future as they wean their facility or reduce their facility over time.
We have a question from Twitter. Somebody asks, what about electricity in cities in Africa? Over 40% of the people in Africa live in cities, not villages.
Well, my book is solely focused on the rural areas because that is, the grid is not there. And when you do the math, it's cheaper to supply solar than to extend the grid. In these major cities, go to Nairobi, go to Kibera, I mean, one of the largest slums in the world. And the reality there is, you can't predict when the lights are going to come on. I mean, I've been in New Delhi when the lights didn't come on. So it kind of told me I need to stay at a better, different hotel. But my only point in saying this is that you have to, it's a different problem. It's another billion people. And it's really all about working with a local state utility. I actually think this is an era, and you're seeing more of this actually, where utility scale renewables are being deployed. But there is a need for significant capital, and maybe it could mean, and it worked in this country and it's worked in Europe and other places, some liberalization of how the system works in those countries. Because state-owned utilities, I mean, the governments don't have the credit to raise the money. You've got to find another way. And let me say, the most capital-intensive industry in the world is the power sector, the utility sector, and the provision of electricity. So attracting capital to these areas is really critical. That's the key.
Other questions? We've got women in the front, and then. Why don't you speak into the microphone for our web crowd and podcast crowd?
How do we get a price on carbon? If Obama didn't do it, who would possibly do it? The corporations are in control, aren't they? And how did you get to be the way you are?
The second question first, Jim. Then
it was a miracle. If you ask my mom, she'd say it was a damn miracle. But I would say that Obama, with the Clean Power Plan, is going to put a price on carbon, puts a cap on emissions. And an aspect of the bill or the regulation, I call it bill because I look at it and it looks like a piece of legislation, more than a regulation, but that's just a guy who's a lawyer by training. But I believe that the government has put a provision in that allows you to create a trading market. So you can do a trading scheme with your state, with surrounding states, and that allows you to drive to low cost. I was a huge supporter of cap and trade when we did it for SO2 in the 1990s. The bottom line on that is we were able to spend $5 billion, reduce dramatically the emissions of SO2, but we did it so much cheaper because we were able to trade allowances. I believe that what Waxman Markey was trying to do in terms of trading allowances made sense because markets work. Cap and trade is sort of like nobody likes that word anymore, but effectively what the EPA did is they have a cap and trade provision in there because you know how much you have to reduce, you know what the cap on your emissions are going to be, so now you find the lowest cost way to do it, and really smart companies, rather than trying to fight this, although there's pieces of it that need to be fixed, what they will do is find a way to work with, you know, whether it's North Carolina working with South Carolina or working with Georgia, create these regional trading centers. We have them today in the Northeast with Reggie. We have it developing in other regions of the country. So creating these trading regimes, and over time, these regional trading regimes will morph into a regional trading system and do what Congress failed to do and didn't have the will to do in '09.
I see a number of hands and we're starting to run out of time. Maybe do a couple of questions at once and start right over here. This gentleman in the second row and then over here after that.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for this. This was really fascinating. My name is Dan Svanner. I'm focused on the financing side of Angle and worked for one of these Belgian banks you talked about. My question, I guess, is understanding the stats you threw out about the percentage of people living on $1 a day versus a little more. Bringing in the World Bank and others makes sense. Training local banks makes sense. But in order to really make it about a profit, I guess, can you walk us through how you get to building a solar plant, remote or not, where someone on $1 a day or $10 a day is actually able to afford paying for this so that there's actual incentive?
Great question. Why don't we hold that and get your question, sir, and then have Mr. Jim answer both.
Hi, this is Yahya. I actually work as a commercial manager with one of the biggest privately owned electric utilities out of Pakistan. You suggested, and you were spot on when you suggested that utility-connected solar power plants are cheaper when it comes to the distributed ones. So when you look at it from a developing country perspective, there are a lot of questions such as coverage of political force majeure events or events of default, that when you are as an investor-owned utility, you don't end up getting sovereign guarantees from the government. Would you maybe elaborate from your experience? How did you manage those?
Two great practical business questions. Kind of walk through how do you make it work with $1 a day of income, and then the kind of these real practical issues, force majeure issues.
No, I think the first reality is you start with a solar lantern. People can afford that. And then two things happen. And you start to provide solar home systems and larger systems. And as you start to bring solar in to improve irrigation, as you start to look at how it supports a community, you have to really, there's not one size fits all. You have to think about the village. Then you have to think about this fact. 1 billion people go to medical clinics with no electricity. So can you provide electricity, maybe not 24/7, but for important periods of the day in that village? 50% of the people in the low-income countries go to primary schools with no electricity. So the model in my mind is not just home by home, but the model is yes that way, but yes also with respect to what I call anchor tenants. And you can devise a business plan that really works in the context of providing it. But the other important thing that you're betting on is you're betting that the capability of pay will increase, and you're betting that the desire for more, whether it's a solar lantern, whether it's a fan, which by the way is usually one of the top things, or whether it is a radio or a TV, and with these more efficient appliances, that becomes more available to people in these areas. So my belief is I've kind of sketched out kind of the pieces of a business plan. Putting those together and how you put them together really leads to a way, but it's predicated on a simple belief that there's going to be economic development and the capability to pay will improve over time. And could you restate your question, please?
So while we were working with a lot of developers and manufacturers such as Sandalow and First Solar, these guys were very interested in doing projects, IPP, independent power plant-based projects, because the government had come up with the best incentives of 18% dollarized IRR. But at the end of the day, we used to struggle in trying to structure the project based on the risk profiling, because it was a single buyer model, or dual buyer model, because there was government-owned entities and just one investor-based entity. So we never were in a position to provide coverage for events related to events of default or change in law or political force majeure events. And we ended up not doing projects with any one of them because the cost of the debt did not match the revenues.
No, I really get that. I mean, I've done business. I own interest in a power plant in Pakistan called Uch.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And Uch, which I've subsequently called Ouch. But it shows you the trickiness of working with the government our plant manager was negotiating with the government with respect to what they should pay us, and he wasn't participating fully, i.e. giving up enough, so they put him in jail. So our mission was to get his family out of there to London and then try to negotiate his release from prison. So in that kind of environment, I mean, as you might guess, I subsequently sold our interest in that power plant. So you got to have a rule of law. You have to have a government that's willing to provide, and the politics of that is tough. So unless you have a government that is open and makes certain guarantees, you're just not going to get the risk profile. You've got it right. You're just not going to get the risk profile. As I said earlier, it all comes back to, is the government going to facilitate it or are they going to block it? And sadly, and this is a political question in a lot of countries, they don't want everybody to have access to electricity. They can't maintain their leadership in the country if the 20% that don't have it get it. And people start moving from poverty into the middle class. They don't want that. And I can name a lot of countries that are like that. In sub-Saharan Africa, in provinces in India, name it, they just don't want it. And so when you have that situation, this challenge is great. But it tells you got to work hard and find a way to get the government to participate. Yes,
we are just about out of time. I see a question here, and in the back, and then here. We'll try to get them all in. Ma'am.
Thanks. Is this on?
It is.
Alexandra Fedorova, Strategy and Consultancy. My question is on your outlook for China energy industry, in particular electricity. A large part of the generation comes today from coal, and at the same time, we do know that there is a stride to reduce and go cleaner, but at the same time, in April 2015, the government has cut the prices for industrial companies, right, in order to subsidize them. So what is your outlook on China electricity, short-term and long-term, and how is it going to impact the businesses in China?
Sure, and I can do that
Why don't
quick.
you go do that, and then
I actually
maybe take the microphone in the back of the room.
I have a huge, Chinese did something remarkable. They lifted 400 million people out of poverty. But they had to build a coal plant every week to get it done because they had to provide electricity because they understood how economic development worked. But the Chinese are leading. They're building 30 nuclear plants. And now they've been retained to build a nuclear plant in the UK. And so they are going to control the supply chain. They're going to have the capability to build them cheaper and build them faster. So they will control that. Today, 9 out of 10 solar panels come from Southeast Asia. The truth of the matter is the Chinese lead in solar panel production. They lead in wind turbine production. They're challenging us with respect to battery technologies. They're moving fast in these areas. They have a really strong need for electric vehicles. If you've never had a car, having an EV as your first car is cool. That's a good answer. No matter what, it should be a cool car, and it is. But my only point I'm making is the Chinese, when they made a commitment to President Obama, they gave him the sleeves out of their vest. They said, well, we're going to start turning carbon emissions down by 30. Hell, they'll be turning it down in the early part of 2020. So by 2025, it'll clearly be going down. These guys are on top of it. They figured it out. And they are driving hard to make it happen. So the Chinese are going to do a great job of driving it down, but you have to worry about countries like India, other countries where they have ample supply of coal. Their desire is going to build more coal.
This is going to have to be our last questions when we take it, and then Jim, why don't you answer, and then any final thoughts
Sure.
you've got.
So my question was, and I think your previous question kind of leads well into this. So what do you think about the possible need for a new school Manhattan project to deal with energy? And then probably a more specific and practical question is, what do you think about the thorium technologies
The what technology?
Thorium?
Yeah, I don't know a lot about thorium, but I do think it has promise, but fusion has promise. Fusion has had promise forever. And so I think that we need to explore. So my concept of, I'd call it a moonshot, call it Manhattan, call it anything. We need to put more and more money into R&D. We have not come up with the perfect way to generate electricity. So we need to put it in R&D. That's the only way. I'm a technologist. I'm an optimist because I look at the power. I mean, I think about the books that were written in the 70s say we're running out of food with a population growth by 2000. Didn't happen. The yield on crops went up dramatically. But so our capability to find solutions to provide electricity, I think are great. We just need to pursue them.
Jim, welcome to the Columbia community. Please join me in giving Jim Rogers a big hand. That's tremendous. Really, really.